Hey everyone, and welcome back. You guys really threw us a curveball with this deep dive.
Oh.
Yeah, with the 2024 elections just days away,
Uh-huh.
you sent us a mountain of info on election integrity.
Or the lack thereof.
Exactly. It seems like every election, both sides are screaming about fraud, and we're trying to figure out what to expect this time around.
Well, the integrity of our elections is definitely the bedrock of our democracy.
For sure.
Instead of getting caught up in all the partisan noise, though,
Hmm.
let's dig into the systems, the vulnerabilities, and even some firsthand accounts of what might be happening behind the scenes.
Okay, so we've got firsthand accounts, data analysis, legal cases, even some insights from mathematicians using something called...
Benford's Law?
Right.
And that's one of the things I find so fascinating about this whole topic.
What's that?
Well, it touches on so many different areas. We're
Yeah.
not just talking about someone like straight up stealing votes.
Yeah.
It's about the potential manipulation of the systems, the suppression of information, and how technology might be playing a role.
It's multifaceted.
Very much so.
So where do we even begin? Honestly, I'm a little intimidated by the sheer volume of material.
A good place to start might be with some real-life stories.
Okay.
We've got this book here called Vote Scam, The Stealing of America, written by two brothers, the Colliers, who've been investigating election integrity for decades.
The Collier brothers. I feel like their names keep popping up in all sorts of election-related discussions.
No, they're everywhere.
I'm curious to hear what they have to say.
Well, they're like these real-life detectives chasing down leads and piecing together this puzzle.
Interesting.
And what's fascinating is that their investigations actually started way back in the 1970s with their own congressional run.
Wow, so this isn't a new phenomenon at all.
Not even close.
They were concerned about election integrity even back then.
Oh, absolutely. They were sounding the alarm about electronic voting machines, arguing that they were essentially uncheckable.
Uncheckable.
Yeah, and they even had a whole chapter in their book about what they called the missing keys scam with print-o-matic voting machines.
Missing keys scam. What is that?
So basically, poll workers weren't given the keys that were needed to verify the initial vote count on these machines.
So they couldn't even be sure that the machines were starting at zero.
Nope.
That seems like a major red flag no matter what side of the aisle you're on.
Exactly. It raises serious questions about transparency and chain of custody.
Right, because if the people overseeing the process can't even verify the most basic steps, how can we trust the entire system?
You can't.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that this was happening decades ago.
Yeah.
Did the Collier brothers continue their investigations beyond that initial experience?
Oh, absolutely. They were still digging into potential fraud well into the 1990s.
Really?
Yeah, they even started looking into the software that news networks use to call elections.
Interesting.
They were deeply suspicious of how exit polls might be used to influence public perception.
They were ahead of their time in a way, weren't they? With all the talk about media influence and potential manipulation these days.
They really were. They also pointed to the increasing role of private companies in our elections, which they saw as a potential vulnerability.
Okay.
They really believed that computerized voting, especially without proper safeguards, was just a recipe for manipulation.
It's a concern that has definitely resurfaced in recent years, especially with worries about hacking and undetectable manipulation of electronic voting systems.
Sure.
So the Colliers' experiences give us a glimpse into some long-standing concerns about election integrity. But let's shift gears for a moment
Okay.
and look at some of the data analysis you mentioned earlier.
Sounds good.
How does that fit into all of this?
We've got some fascinating research that uses something called Benford's Law to spot potential anomalies in vote counts.
Benford's Law.
Yeah.
I'm going to need you to break that down for me.
Okay, so it's this statistical principle that analyzes the distribution of digits in naturally occurring data sets.
Okay.
It might sound a little counterintuitive, but it turns out that the number 1 appears as the leading digit way more frequently than 9 in lots of real-world data sets. And there's this predictable pattern across all the digits.
So how does that relate to vote totals?
Well, theoretically, vote totals should also follow this natural distribution of digits.
Okay.
But if there's manipulation, if someone is artificially inflating a candidate's vote count, the distribution of those leading digits might be skewed.
So it's like a statistical red flag, a way to potentially spot if something's off.
Exactly. Think of it like a smoke detector.
Yeah.
It can alert us that something needs further scrutiny, but it doesn't tell us what caused the fire, so to speak.
Gotcha.
It's not proof of fraud on its own, but it can be a starting point for further investigation.
So we've got firsthand accounts from investigators raising concerns and data analysis that might highlight irregularities.
Right.
What else is in this giant pile of information?
Well, we also have this database compiled by the Heritage Foundation,
Okay.
and it lists election fraud convictions going all the way back to the 1970s. It gives us a glimpse into the kinds of fraud that have actually been proven in court.
But I imagine it only captures a tiny fraction of the potential fraud that might be happening.
Probably.
It's just the cases that were actually caught and successfully prosecuted.
That's true. But even this limited view reveals some recurring patterns.
Like what?
Well, we see cases of ineligible voting, duplicate voting, and fraudulent use of absentee ballots, which has become a particularly contentious area in recent years.
Speaking of absentee ballots, there's been a lot of talk about them lately. Are there any specific cases from the Heritage Foundation database that stand out?
There's one from Florida in 2023 where a man named John Ryder was charged with duplicate voting.
Okay.
He voted in person in Florida and then also by absentee ballot in New York.
Wow, that seems like a pretty clear-cut case of fraud, but how is that even possible?
It really highlights the challenges of maintaining accurate voter rolls across different states.
Yeah.
And it also raises concerns about the security and verification of absentee ballots, especially as their use has become more widespread.
Right, and we saw those concerns amplified during the 2020 election with all the debate about mail-in voting.
Definitely.
It seems like there's room for improvement in how we handle absentee ballots, for sure.
There's always room for improvement.
Oh, well.
The database also includes a case from Kentucky in 2024 involving a woman named Mary Jackson,
Okay.
who was convicted for her role in a vote-buying scheme.
Vote buying. That still happens.
It does. She and her family conspired to bribe voters and obtain blank ballots to help elect a specific candidate.
It's pretty shocking that that kind of thing still goes on.
It undermines the very principle of free and fair elections.
Right. Votes should be based on individual choice, not coercion or financial incentives.
Exactly. And unfortunately, these types of cases, while perhaps not widespread, continue to occur.
So we've seen examples of individual fraud from the Collier brothers' experiences to those legal cases.
Right.
But what about larger scale manipulation of systems or technology? Is that even possible?
That's where things get even more complicated.
How?
Well, it's much harder to detect and prove systemic fraud, as it often involves exploiting vulnerabilities that are difficult to trace.
I see.
But there are definitely concerns about it.
Like the controversy surrounding Dominion voting machines.
Exactly.
Those were used in several key states during the 2020 election, and there were allegations of hacking, manipulation of software, and a lack of transparency.
Dominion has been under intense scrutiny for sure, although they've vehemently denied any wrongdoing.
Okay.
Some of the concerns raised include allegations that a Dominion VP made comments suggesting he ensured Trump wouldn't win.
Really?
And a forensic report in Colorado allegedly found that a system update wiped election data from machines.
Wiping election data, that's disturbing.
These are serious allegations that warrant thorough investigation.
Of course.
However, it's crucial to separate speculation and hearsay from verifiable evidence.
Right.
The claims about the Dominion VP have been widely disputed, and the details of the Colorado forensic report are still being debated.
So how do we navigate this sea of conflicting information? It feels like we're constantly bombarded with claims and counterclaims, making it difficult to determine what's true.
That's the challenge we all face in the age of information overload. It's crucial to be critical consumers of information.
What do you mean?
We need to evaluate sources, consider different perspectives, and demand evidence-based conclusions.
Right. We can't just accept claims at face value, especially when they're politically charged.
Exactly.
So where does all of this leave us?
Yeah.
With everything we've discussed, are our elections fundamentally broken?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's clear that there are vulnerabilities in our election systems.
Yeah.
And that instances of fraud have occurred both on an individual and potentially larger scale.
But is it widespread enough to actually overturn major election results?
That's where things get a bit more nuanced.
All right.
Our elections are these complex, decentralized processes with multiple layers of oversight. And the evidence suggests that while fraud is a real concern, it's not necessarily widespread or systematic enough to change the outcome of major elections.
But what about all the allegations of massive fraud that we hear from both sides, especially after really close elections? It seems like every time someone loses, they cry foul.
Those allegations absolutely need to be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly.
For sure.
However, it's important to distinguish between allegations and proven facts.
Right.
Oftentimes, the rhetoric surrounding election fraud is fueled by partisan motivations and a desire to delegitimize opponents.
So how do we as informed citizens sort through all of this? How do we separate fact from fiction and develop informed opinions about the integrity of our elections?
It requires a commitment to critical thinking, seeking out credible sources, and being willing to engage with different viewpoints,
Even when they make us uncomfortable.
even when they make us uncomfortable.
It also means demanding transparency from our election officials and holding them accountable for ensuring the integrity of the process. So essentially, we need to be more discerning about the information we consume and more proactive in demanding accountability from those who run our elections.
Exactly, and it's an ongoing process.
Okay.
There's always more to learn, more to question, and more to do to ensure that our elections truly reflect the will of the people.
We've covered a lot of ground already, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
Well-
What's next in our deep dive? What other aspects of election integrity should we be exploring?
Well, we've still got plenty to unpack. We'll delve into more specific allegations of fraud, explore the role of the media in shaping perceptions of elections, and examine potential solutions for strengthening our democratic processes.
I'm ready to dive back in. This has been incredibly eye-opening so far, and for everyone listening, stay tuned. We're just getting started.
So, picking up where we left off, let's take a closer look at a specific case that's generated a lot of buzz, the 2000 Mules film.
Ah, yes. The documentary that claimed to expose all that widespread ballot harvesting during the 2020 election.
Exactly.
I remember it's sparked a ton of controversy.
Yeah. Especially among conservative circles.
Right. So, remind me, what was the main argument of the film again?
It was produced by Dinesh D'Souza,
Okay.
and it uses cell phone location data and surveillance footage to argue that thousands of individuals, they called them mules, were paid to illegally collect and deliver ballots.
They claimed that these mules were making all these repeat visits to ballot drop boxes and nonprofit organizations.
Right, suggesting this organized effort to influence the vote.
Okay, so the film obviously made a big splash, but I know its findings have been challenged quite a bit.
Oh yeah, they've been disputed by fact-checkers, election experts, even some conservative commentators.
What are some of the main criticisms of the film?
Well, one major criticism is that cell phone location data, while helpful, isn't precise enough to definitively prove that someone actually deposited a ballot.
So someone could have just been walking by, driving past, or even living nearby.
Exactly.
And their phone data would still show up in the film's analysis.
Yep, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Right, just because your phone was near a drop box doesn't mean you did anything illegal.
Exactly. The film also relies heavily on surveillance footage, but critics argue that a lot of it is pretty inconclusive.
How so?
Well, the footage is often grainy, taken from a distance, and it doesn't clearly show any illegal activity taking place.
So it's open to interpretation.
Very much so. And critics say that the filmmakers basically cherry-picked footage that fit their narrative.
But the filmmakers argue that they corroborated the cell phone data with the surveillance footage and other evidence
They do.
to build a compelling case.
They do, but a lot of experts remain unconvinced,
Okay.
arguing that the film's claims are ultimately based on conjecture and a very selective presentation of data.
It sounds like 2000 Mules is a prime example of how tricky it can be to separate fact from fiction when it comes to election integrity.
It really is.
It's a good reminder that we have to be critical of all sources of information.
Absolutely, regardless of who's presenting them.
And this kind of brings us to another important aspect of this whole debate, the role of the media in shaping perceptions of elections.
Right. It does feel like every election cycle is just filled with these accusations of media bias, spin, and misinformation.
It's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
The media definitely plays a powerful role in framing narratives and influencing public opinion.
Yeah.
It's super important to be aware of potential biases and to get your news from a variety of sources to try to get a more balanced perspective.
One of the sources we have claims that the media coverage of the 2020 election was really skewed in favor of Joe Biden,
Okay.
saying that negative stories about Trump were amplified while positive stories were suppressed, creating a distorted view of the race.
It's true that media outlets have their own leanings,
Right.
and these can definitely influence their coverage.
Yeah.
Some outlets are more transparent about their leanings than others.
Right.
However, it's important to avoid making sweeping generalizations and to evaluate each story on its own merits.
Look at the evidence. Consider the source. And don't jump to conclusions based on headlines or sound bites.
Exactly. This source also claims that social media companies engaged in censorship
Interesting.
to try to silence conservative voices and limit the reach of pro-Trump content.
That's been a hot-button issue, the role of social media in elections.
It has.
There are concerns about the spread of misinformation, the potential for foreign interference, and the power these platforms have to shape public discourse.
It's a very complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah,
On one hand, you have the need to protect free speech,
right.
but on the other hand, there's the responsibility to try to prevent the spread of harmful content, which is hard to define.
And even harder to police.
Exactly.
It seems like these social media companies are constantly walking a tightrope, trying to balance these competing interests.
They are, and it's really hard to know what impact their decisions actually have on election outcomes.
It's a bit of a black box.
It is, it's definitely an area that needs ongoing scrutiny, transparency, and debate. And as users of these platforms, it's crucial to be aware of the potential for manipulation and to be critical consumers of the information we encounter online.
Okay, so we've talked about allegations of fraud, the complexities of the 2000 Mules film, and the role of the media and social media in shaping the narrative around elections.
Right.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. And with the 2024 election just around the corner, it's more important than ever to engage with these issues thoughtfully and critically.
But where do we go from here? Are there actual solutions for strengthening our elections and restoring trust in the system?
There are definitely potential solutions that have been proposed.
Okay.
They range from policy changes to technological advancements, and they all aim to address the vulnerabilities we've discussed.
Like what? What are some of the most common suggestions?
One suggestion is to strengthen voter ID laws.
To prevent ineligible voting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea is to make it much harder for those who aren't legally allowed to vote to cast a ballot.
I can see how that would help, but I know this is a controversial issue.
It is.
With concerns that stricter ID requirements could disenfranchise minority voters.
And that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
It's crucial that any changes to voting laws are implemented in a way that ensures equal access to the ballot for all eligible citizens.
Right. Accessibility and security need to go hand in hand.
Exactly what other solutions are out there.
When we talked about absentee voting
Right.
and how there have been concerns about its security.
There are definitely calls to improve the security and transparency of the process, especially as it continues to grow in popularity.
What kind of measures are people suggesting?
Things like stricter signature verification tracking of ballots and more robust audits to ensure accuracy and prevent fraud.
Okay.
These measures are aimed at addressing those concerns about potential manipulation that we talked about earlier.
And I know the Collier brothers were strong advocates for a return to hand-counted paper ballots.
Yeah.
Is that a realistic solution?
It's an idea that's gained some traction. The argument is that hand counting is the most secure and transparent method, less vulnerable to hacking or manipulation.
But isn't it incredibly time-consuming?
It can be.
And potentially prone to human error, especially in these large-scale elections.
Those are all valid points.
Yeah.
Hand counting, while appealing in its simplicity, definitely presents logistical challenges. But it's a debate worth having as we weigh the trade-offs between security, efficiency, and cost.
And technology is constantly changing, too.
Yeah.
Are there any promising technological solutions on the horizon?
There are some really interesting efforts underway to develop more secure and transparent voting technologies with the goal of enhancing security and auditability.
What are they focusing on?
Well, some folks are exploring the use of blockchain technology,
Interesting.
which is known for its security and immutability.
Right.
Others are advocating for open source software, which allows for more transparency and independent verification.
It sounds like there's no magic bullet.
There is.
It's going to take a multifaceted approach to address all the concerns about election integrity.
Absolutely. It's about addressing the vulnerabilities in the system, improving transparency, promoting media literacy, and fostering a culture of civic engagement where everyone feels like their vote matters and that the process is fair.
It's a tall order.
It is, but it's vital for the health of our democracy.
And it's not just about the institutions and the technologies.
Right.
It's about us, the citizens.
It is. We have a responsibility to be informed, to engage in respectful dialogue, even when we disagree, and to hold our elected officials accountable.
We need to demand better from our leaders.
And from ourselves.
You're right. We can't just sit back and expect someone else to fix it.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play in safeguarding our democracy.
And this is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
It's not about achieving some perfect system overnight, but about continually striving to improve, to adapt, and to build a more resilient and trustworthy electoral process.
This deep dive has been eye-opening.
I agree.
I'm feeling a mix of concern and cautious optimism.
I get that.
Concerned about the vulnerabilities, but also optimism that we can work together to strengthen our elections, ensure that every vote truly counts.
That's the spirit this deep dive has hopefully equipped you with the knowledge and critical thinking skills to navigate this complex issue and participate in shaping the future of our democracy.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll examine some historical examples of election controversy, delve into the legal frameworks that govern our elections, and consider the broader implications of these issues for the future of our democracy.
As we wrap up our deep dive into election integrity, let's take a step back
Okay.
and look at some historical examples of election controversy in the U.S.
Because this isn't just a 21st century thing, right?
Yeah.
There have been accusations of fraud and dirty tricks throughout our history.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, some people argue that a certain level of gamesmanship has always been a part of American politics.
One of our sources talks about the 1960 presidential election. That nail-biter between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon.
That election was definitely shrouded in controversy, especially in Illinois.
Right.
Allegations of fraud in Chicago, a Democratic stronghold cast a shadow over Kennedy's narrow victory.
I've heard about that. Wasn't there speculation that Mayor Daley's political machine in Chicago might have generated enough fraudulent votes to swing the state and ultimately the election for Kennedy?
That's the allegation that's kind of persisted over the years.
Wow.
It's tough to prove definitively, even with extensive investigations and recounts.
Right.
But it highlights how, even back in the pre-digital age, the potential for manipulation and the importance of public trust were already apparent.
So even way back then, people were worried about the integrity of the process.
Yeah, it's not just a modern-day thing.
Not at all. And it shows that these concerns can come up no matter which party is involved.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the source we have actually mentions this grand jury report from 1984.
Okay.
That detailed a pattern of fraud in Chicago.
Chicago again.
Including vote buying, false registrations, even altering vote counts.
It's a good reminder that these efforts to manipulate outcomes have been around for a while.
A long while.
And that we always have to be vigilant.
Always. And it also highlights the need for strong legal frameworks to protect our elections.
Right, because we do have laws and systems in place to try to prevent these things from happening, right?
We do. The U.S. has a really complex system of election laws, regulations, and oversight mechanisms.
Wow.
Both at the federal and state levels.
Okay.
It's a multi-layered system that's designed to protect the integrity of the process.
One of our sources, a scholarly paper on election fraud, really emphasizes the importance of transparency and accountability when it comes to maintaining public confidence in elections.
For sure, the authors argue that clear rules, open procedures, and accessible information are essential for deterring fraud and allowing for meaningful oversight.
Basically, if you can't see how the sausage is made,
Right.
how can you be sure it's safe to eat?
Exactly. When things are done in secret, it breeds distrust.
It makes sense. They also point to the need for good election administration.
Robust is the word they use.
Robust, okay.
So that means having trained officials, secure equipment, and well-defined procedures for handling ballots and resolving disputes.
It's not just about the laws. It's about competent and trustworthy people administering them effectively.
It is, and there needs to be effective enforcement as well.
Right.
Consequences for those who break election laws.
Whether it's individuals or officials.
Exactly. Accountability is key. But I imagine there's always this tension between security and making things easy for voters.
Oh, for sure. The paper talks about that very challenge. Balancing security with accessibility.
Right.
We want to make it as easy as possible for eligible citizens to vote, but we also need to protect the system from manipulation.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balancing act.
It is. And as technology continues to change, new challenges and vulnerabilities will pop up.
They will, which is why we need to constantly be adapting and innovating, evaluating our systems, finding those weaknesses, and implementing solutions to strengthen them.
So we've explored the history, the legal frameworks, and the ongoing challenge of balancing security and accessibility.
We have.
What does it all mean for the future of our democracy? Where do we go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
The integrity of our elections is fundamental to the health and the legitimacy of our entire democracy.
Right.
If people stop trusting the system, if they believe their vote doesn't matter...
Or that the outcome is already decided.
Exactly. It can have really bad consequences.
It can lead to apathy, cynicism, even unrest.
People might just completely disengage from the political process.
Tune it all out.
Yeah. That's why it's crucial to address these concerns about fraud promote transparency and accountability,
Okay?
and foster a culture of civic engagement where everyone feels like they have a stake in the system.
It's a shared responsibility.
It
It's
is.
not just on the government.
It's on all of us.
We, the citizens, have a role to play as well.
Absolutely. It starts with being informed, engaging in respectful dialogue, and holding our elected officials accountable,
Even when we disagree with each other,
especially when we disagree.
it means being willing to challenge our own biases, to consider different viewpoints, and to really look for credible sources of information.
Couldn't agree more.
We can't just stay in our echo chambers
Right.
and consume information that just reinforces what we already believe.
We need to engage with those different viewpoints and have those open and honest conversations about these issues.
Well said. This deep dive has hopefully given you a better understanding of how complex election integrity really is.
It is a complex issue.
But this is just the beginning.
The tip of the iceberg.
There's so much more to explore, and it's an ongoing conversation we need to keep having.
As a society.
For sure, this has been an eye-opening journey,
It really has.
and I'm feeling concerned, but also a little bit empowered.
I understand that.
Concerned about everything we've talked about, but also empowered to do my part in protecting our democracy.
That's the spirit. Informed, engaged, and committed to making sure our elections are free, fair, and truly represent what the people want.
That's a great way to put it. This deep dive has been a wild ride full of information and insights, and if you're feeling as fired up as I am, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who needs a little election season reality check.
And remember, the future of our democracy really is in our hands.